Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. And thank you for SINFO for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit and tell you a few stories from my career in Silicon Valley, where I've worked for a while, mostly on payments-related stuff. So I came to the United States in 2002 with my wife, my then one-year-old son, and my then three-year-old daughter. Like any immigrant, I was determined to make sure that everything would go well for me and for my family, and I was determined to do anything I needed to make that happen. I was, in my head, I was really ready to flip burgers if that's what it took. It really didn't matter. I was determined. But, I kind of hoped that it wouldn't come to that because I had worked previously in software engineering, and I was kind of hoping that I would be able to find a job in that field. But 2002 was a little bit of a hard time in the U.S., and it was just right after the dot-com crash. So it wasn't sure, it wasn't clear whether this will happen. But a few months later, I was able to find a job as a software engineer at PayPal. And it really was my first big break. It was very challenging. The commute was very long. Everyone there was much younger than I was. Almost no one had kids, and it was a different culture. I had to get used to doing things a little differently. For example, people would be, sometimes have alcohol in the office and occasionally drink when there was like a happy occasion or something like that. It was totally foreign to me. A few months in, my manager asked me to work on internationalizing addresses. So, you have to remember at the time, PayPal was very, very US-centric. I think most internet companies in the early 2000s were very US-centric. The web was not as big outside of the US. Even the US, it wasn't that big. And it wasn't uncommon for this to happen. But across the PayPal code base, you would find those, if user is international, then a whole set of stuff. But the main code was like assuming that the user was a US user. So not surprisingly, this is how addresses looked in the PayPal code base and on the site. They had address 1, address 2, city, state, zip, country, and this, of course, is a very US-centric way of dealing with addresses. And as you know, addresses have a lot of variety in terms of the format, even the characters that, of course, we use for them because they represent the great diversity that we have in the world. So what we decided to do is to use the fundamental theorem of software engineering. We basically decided to take a library, and we were lucky to find a library that could replace addresses in our code. Instead of going and looking directly at addresses, we would send the address or pass the address to a library, and that library would then present the address to the user in the right format. It would also, we were lucky enough that the library also was able to present forms for users to enter their addresses. So all that remained was to go through the entire code base and have lots and lots of files where I would go in and make a change of, instead of referring directly to the address, referring to the library. Now that's considered in Silicon Valley grunt work. Right? It doesn't require a lot of thinking. You have to do basically the same thing again and again. And it will take many, many weeks for this to happen. In addition, if you do everything right, then no one really notices. Right? I mean, most people in the US will still have the same address format that they used to see, and most employees will also see it the same way. But if you mess up, everyone will notice. So it's this kind of work that people don't really want to do. But for me, I embraced it and jumped in with great enthusiasm, and I was like really determined to make this thing work. I worked really hard and spent many days going through the code, file after file, and I was able to finish my first task ahead of schedule, and I did it well. And of course, the point here is not that I'm so great because I was able to do it ahead of schedule. The point is that being hungry is a very strong motivator. So remember that and use it. You should remember that for yourself. You should know this about other people, but you should use it carefully. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to take advantage of people. But figuratively speaking, being hungry is very, very powerful. At the time, PayPal's database was running on one big Oracle machine. Of course, whenever you have one big machine doing anything, there's a limit to how much it can grow. And the database was growing pretty well for PayPal, but it was getting close to the edge of its capacity. It was already running on probably the maximum amount of memory it could have. It already had all the disk space it could have, and it had almost all the CPUs that it could have. I think it was running on 96 CPUs, and the maximum was 128. And of course, PayPal was growing very, very fast. So it was very clear that within a year, maybe 18 months, the database will just collapse, would not be able to handle the load. And that, of course, is a existential threat for a company like PayPal. So they put their best engineers on trying to figure out a solution to this. So basically, the problem is, you want to send money, right? PayPal is all about sending money. So you want to send money between two users or two accounts. And when you have a single database doing it, it's, I wouldn't say simple, but it's predictable. Like you can have a transaction that takes care of this. And when I say a transaction, I mean that the transfer of money will either happen or it will not happen. It's not going to get stuck in the middle. It's not going to happen halfway. Right? And one database can guarantee that, can have that guarantee. But when you have more than one database, for example, two, it's really hard to guarantee that because now you have two databases. The transfer has to occur between the databases potentially, and it can get stuck, right? One database can deduct the sum, and the other might not be able to add it to the balance. And of course, that's not something you want to do. So in order to do that, the engineers came up with, or decided to use, a system called two-phase commit. And two-phase commit, I'm not going to go into the details of it. It's just briefly here on the slides. Two-phase commit is a system that actually is able to do something like a funds transfer across two databases and keep track of everything to make sure that it happens transactionally. So it either happens or doesn't happen. It doesn't get stuck in the middle. But in order to do that, two-phase commit requires close coordination between the two databases, and it also requires much more state to be saved in those databases, which means that you have to do a lot more writes and a lot more traffic. So for one funds transfer in the old world where you have a single database, it would take one action. You just go to the database and say, do this. In the new world of two-phase commit, there's multiple steps that are required. Each one of them you have to go to at least one database, or maybe more, and tell them to do something. So it increases the load on the database by a lot. And the engineers were aware of that, right? They knew that it's going to be hard and it's going to be complicated, and they did a lot of load testing, and they also told the production people that this is coming and that more load is coming to the database, which caused the production people, unbeknownst to the engineers, to decide to upgrade the production database because for them it was there's like more traffic coming, there's more load, that we want to enhance the database and add the CPUs, then get it to 128 CPUs so that it's as performant as possible for the new code. So remember though, before we move forward with the story, right, that PayPal at the time, like many other companies, used the waterfall model. So things would happen one after the other. One team would develop, then it would, once it was done developing, hand off the code to another team, which would test, which will then hand off to another team that would deploy. And in particular, The deploy process at PayPal I think the term is stand and fight. So PayPal would deploy code to production, make the database changes, and then fix whatever problem happened, and do that by deploying more code until everything was done, until the website was operational. So it was always roll forward. On top of that, the two-phase commit changes were massive, right? There's a lot of code changes. They also changed the data structure of the database, and therefore the two-phase commit was really not something that you could ever roll back. Once it was in production, you had to fix it, you had to make it work. So it was a one-way door. It's a door that once you cross the threshold, you cannot go back. So all of this came together, and of course the database actually worked less good with not 128 CPUs, because there was more contention between the CPUs trying to access memory. So it slowed down. Not just didn't work faster, it actually worked, much slower. And the two-phase commit code created load in areas where, the engineers didn't expect and were not properly tested. And over the next several weeks, the PayPal website was, intermittently up and down, had a lot of issues. This is actually a down page for Pixar, but I thought it was, I couldn't find the 404 for PayPal. And engineers worked around the clock to try and fix the website. I was actually in the graveyard shift, so-called. I would come in to work at 10 p.m. and work until 5 a.m. and replaced by other engineers. So it was kind of a 24/7, all hands on deck situation for several weeks until the website was consistently back up. So this really crystallized in my mind the importance of understanding one-way doors and being very, very careful with them. I really think one-way doors, if at all possible, should be avoided. But if you can't avoid it, you have to really know what you're getting into, that you're going through a place like that, and prepare yourself for it. Also, working cross-functionally is very important. Just because you tell another team is not enough. You have to collaborate with that team. Just like the engineers talk to the production people, but they didn't really work together to make sure that the new code was tested on the new machines. Had they done that, they would have maybe discovered that the more CPUs didn't solve the problem and make matters worse. And also that experimentation in general is critical. Whenever possible, it's good to try and avoid big bang kind of launches, and it's better to launch things gradually. By the way, as a result of this rollback, or as a result of this episode, lots of new technologies were developed inside PayPal to help prevent situations like that in the future. This is the network operation centers for PayPal looks kind of like this, maybe not as tall, but this is not unlike how it looks. And one day I was there helping to roll out a feature, and there was an issue. And the feature was causing a lot of load on the site and was going to basically cause the site to melt down. And I was able to help one of the engineers there use a framework that I created as part of this to disable features, to basically prevent a feature from running without having to change any code, which helped save the PayPal website on that time, and was kind of my 5 seconds of fame on that day. A few years later, I was working for a startup that wasn't really going anywhere, and I ran into a friend of mine who worked at Google, and he introduced me to this new project that he was working with another Googler on, and the name of the project was Google Wallet. When I joined Google, I was really, really excited and impressed with how the engineering culture at Google was so strong. People were very rigorous, very thoughtful. It was really an engineering-first culture. People would debate almost like in an academic fashion the merits of different changes and different PRs. And I think there was a sense that people take their work and their engineering aspects of their work very, very seriously. The project, Google Wallet, was a very exciting project. It was going to take on entrenched interests, the banking industry, credit cards, mobile carriers, and due to them, the classic Silicon Valley, disintermediation or disruption. The idea was very simple, right? Allow people to pay with their phone. And you all know this exists today, but this was in 2010. And I was very excited to join the project. The project team was very into incremental changes and lots of experimentation, and we were working as a little startup inside Google. We thought we had the best of both worlds. We were like, oh, we're a startup, but we have all the funds and support of Google behind us. Within a few months, because we were working and iterating quickly, we had our first demo, which was a prototype in production, in the wild, and we were actually able to move money. I used this phone similar to this, a Nexus S, in 2010 to go and buy myself a candy bar at some convenience store near my house, which was very exciting. But the project team was very, very audacious. You have to be if you're doing something as big as that. And some people, might even say arrogant. And there's a lot of friction, a lot of cultural differences between, the old industries and those techies from Silicon Valley. And as you can imagine, as soon as those industries, people started understanding more what Google Wallet was about and what it was going to do, they started pushing back. So, the road started becoming a lot more difficult for us in the project. So the whole idea behind Wallet, as it was imagined by the team, was a secure element, which is exactly the same chip that you see on credit cards, or is exactly the same kind of chip, except inside the phone. And then it works just as the credit card does in a contactless fashion. So you tap the phone, the chip communicates and completes a payments transaction. But because the project was mostly a US-centric project at the time, it depended on those EMV readers, those chip and pin readers, to be deployed, which wasn't the case. The US was far behind Europe in that sense, whereas Europe, I believe, in 2005 did the rollout and switched to chip and pin. As of 2010, US had not really switched in any meaningful way. It actually was a few years later that there was a very widely publicized large hacking of Target and a few other large merchants that the rollout of those terminals really kicked into gear. And only recently, really, has the US really finished most of the transition. So that slowed down the project greatly because there was actually not that many places you could use your phone to pay for anything. In addition to that, Verizon, I think the main carrier, the biggest carrier in the US, decided to not allow a wallet on its phones. They came up with some reason not to do that, but this is what Verizon users would see on their phones when they tried to use Wallet. So, what began as a very exciting, very promising project with a lot of excitement turned into this project that was really not going anywhere. In the years that followed, there was a lot of attrition, of top talent, many org changes, many direction changes, and the project basically didn't go anywhere. It was only much, much later when Apple came out with Apple Pay that the project got reimagined and rebranded Google Pay. It then started using a different technology, not directly using those those secure elements. It used something called HCE, host card emulation. But the bottom line is it took Apple launching Apple Pay for the project to actually get the wind and the energy that it needed to become a successful project. And if you ask anyone, consumers, right, everyone knows that Apple Pay is the one that did this, and then Google is the Me Too player in this. I'm not bitter about this at all, by the way. So I think one of the things this really helped me understand is that focus is super, super important. As you can see here very clearly, right, when you're focusing on something, your field of vision is much smaller. But what you see very clearly. And I think that was super important. Google is a company that still does and did a lot of different things at the time. And the conflict between Android and Wallet was partly the problem here, right? Of course, not the only problem, not the reason, but think about people having to make a decision. What would they support? If you want to support Android, you want Verizon on your side. If you want to support Wallet, you have to go against Verizon, right? And that's an example of a difficult trade-off that someone had to make at Google, and they chose a certain direction, right? So when you work in a company, or when you have a company that does a lot of things, there's inevitable conflict internally that can cause problems like I described. So if you want to focus, it's good to focus all your energy and efforts behind one project. And if you don't do that, you run the risk of having this cannibalization happen. Years later, I decided to join Airbnb. And I was really, really impressed with Airbnb's culture, and was really excited with the rate of growth and how Airbnb was doing things. It was really, it really made me feel like I can finally be myself at work. Airbnb's culture of belonging, where everyone is encouraged to belong everywhere, and diversity is an important thing, both in the platform and in the office, was really, really important to me. And I joined the payments team at Airbnb, and I was very impressed with the team. It was really a joy to work with the team. Everyone was really committed to what they were doing, really excited about Airbnb's mission and trying to make it happen. But it was also very clear that the team needed to grow up. The team needed to be able to take more ownership of the code it owned, of its production systems, and generally extract itself and separate itself from the chaos that sometimes accompanies product change in a company that's growing as fast as Airbnb. So we embarked on a project to separate the payments code, in particular the payments gateway code, from the main code base. The payments gateway handles all the interactions that Airbnb has with external payment processors. And because Airbnb operates in more than 190 countries, it has numerous integrations with pay-in and pay-out providers. So, it has many, many different ways in which it can charge users, and many other different ways in which it can pay out hosts. So we decided to move out all that code and create one of the first Java services at Airbnb. And you can imagine it like replacing the foundation under a house when the family is still inside and still growing and building, and the house is growing also. It was a pretty risky thing. It was kind of scary, but not doing it seemed like an even greater risk. So we built the service, and it had a lot of the checkboxes that you want when you want to deal with payments at scale. Immutable data. We would code and develop using small changes. We took care of sharding from day one, so we don't have any two-phase commit issues. We made sure that the service fails fast, so that if there's any problem, we can find it quickly before users do. And really, the service was very well received. Working on the service was a real pleasure. It was one of the best times in my career. And it's running still in production, handling billions of dollars a year, moving money in and out of Airbnb. And I think one of the reasons the service worked well and we were able to do this in a fairly short amount of time, it took 18 months from the first design until the integrations were mostly done, was because we had a very strong and very high-functioning team. So we were a very small team. It was between 3 and 6 engineers. And we were very focused on this one thing, which was getting that service shipped. And we were very focused on doing it right and doing it well. And we had the support of our manager, which basically prevented unnecessary distractions from coming our way. We didn't have very many meetings. We didn't have very many interruptions. It was just code, code, code every day, and it was great. It was just a pleasure to be developing and building something and seeing the results in front of you, right? It's like really something that I sometimes miss. It was a lot of fun. And I think to bring this all together, let's think for a second about what we've talked today, right? So just as a reminder, grunt work is sometimes needed. One-way doors are really, really, really dangerous. Try to avoid them whenever you can. Great technology isn't always enough, and the support of your company and your manager can be very, very important. Thank you so much for your time, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
So does anybody have any questions? No questions?
Hello. And you have many experiences in different companies like Google, that is a large company, and another company that are smaller. And how do you think this, the work you did in those companies impacted your career? And what do you recommend for someone that is starting its career now, if it's worth it to invest in a bigger company, or go another way and start to work in a smaller company with a smaller teams and projects and so on?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, the way I think about it is I try to think about what I learned in every place. And I think every place I did learn something, and I grew as a person and as an engineer. But I think I learned different things in different places. So if I compare, for example, when I was at Google, I sometimes think of Google as this huge university, right? It's like a practice university. You learn by doing, but you learn, they have really good practices, and they do things really well. So, if you spend a few years there, and by the way, Google is not the only company that's like that. I mean, look at all the big tech companies today. I think they're more or less, the same in that regard. If you spend a few years in one of those large, well-established tech companies, I think you learn a lot about how to do things well and how to do things right, and what is the best practice, and all those things that are really, really important. I think small companies, typically you have to wear many hats, and you also get to have a lot more responsibility, comparatively speaking. So for the same amount of experience, you'll have more responsibility. Of course, I'm greatly simplifying and maybe generalizing, but just to compare. So in those places, I think a lot of what you're going to learn is like, what can you bring and how can you grow inside a company like that, right? So I don't think one path is better than the other. I don't think you should be only in large companies or only in small companies. I think having an experience in both is probably, a good idea, because then you'll learn from both sides and both aspects. And I don't think you should. There's one way to go about it. It's not that I think you must go first to a big company, then you have to go to a startup for 3 years. It's not that prescriptive. I think no matter where you go, the important thing is that you enjoy what you do, because if you enjoy what you do, you'll do it better, and then you'll be more successful. And I think have pride in what you do, as you work, right? This is not just, let's just get this thing done and shipped and throw it over the wall, right? You want to take pride in your work and really think about it as something important. Doesn't matter if you're doing this little thing in a big company or this big project in a startup. Doesn't matter, right? You can do it well either way.
One more question. And what are the things that Airbnb are investing nowadays?
What are the things that what?
Airbnb are doing these days? Like they are investing in security or in cloud computing or in machine learning. Yeah. And what can we expect from it the next years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think all of the above, by the way. Airbnb is growing very, very fast, has been growing very fast for several years. I think the main thing, before I go into the details, the main thing the Airbnb is doing is catching up with its growth. So the growth of the company is faster, has been faster than the growth of the infrastructure for several years. Right? No matter how fast the infrastructure grows, the company grows faster than that. So it's a, excuse me, that's a game of catch up. So everywhere you look in Airbnb, there's growth in terms of development. So the infrastructure is growing, the product teams in terms of what they're building. Now Airbnb is investing a lot in machine learning. That is key to many of its activities. For example, pricing. For example, trust and fraud protection. It's of course very critical to future planning. But security is of course critical, and there's a lot of investment in that. Cloud computing, there's also tons of investment. Airbnb is expanding all the time and needs to keep developing its cloud footprint to be able to do that. So it's a very interesting place right now. It's growing very fast. I think Slack is another place that the previous speaker that is also growing very fast. There's a few of those companies that are now at that level that they've grown very fast, but they continue to grow and they need to upscale their infrastructure. But Airbnb is definitely at that point.
Hi, one question. How big are the teams at Airbnb, and how many services are they taking care of in one team? So how big is the scope of work that you have?
Yeah. So teams at Airbnb typically are around, I would say, between 6 and 16, right? So people. That's a pretty wide range. It really depends on many factors. For example, which area the team is working on, and sometimes it's just how fast the area has grown. But that's generally speaking the size of teams at Airbnb. But if you ask what is the aspirational size, it's the 2-pizza team is kind of the philosophy, which is a Jeff Bezos reference. He always says that teams should be able to be fed by 2 pizzas. Like that's the ideal size for a team. So I think that's kind of that sounds about right. In terms of services, it also varies. Some teams maintain 1 or 2 services. Some teams maintain a few more. But generally speaking, it's a handful of services that teams maintain. But those services differ, right? The gateway that I was describing here is a rather complicated service. It has a lot of operational complexity. There are other services that are more simple. So that also varies between teams.
More questions?
Thank you for your presentation and explanation. If you think if there's a big risk in the product not being viable in the end, do you think that these big companies overvalue the enforcement of best practices, or do you
Yeah.
think otherwise?
Yeah. So if I understand your question correctly, you're talking about the trade-off between how experimental the product is and how much investment you want to make in building it. So, you know, I might be on the extreme side of this. I'll admit that right off the gate. But I believe that, you know, those best practices, there's a reason why they exist. Right? There's a reason why people have determined that, for example, it's really good to write tests with every change you make. Every time you make a change to the code, you should write a test, right? And some people might say, which is, you know, kind of what you were asking around, oh, you know, why should we write a test? This code, maybe in a week we're going to decide that it's not even important and we're going to throw it away, so, you know, it's a waste of time. But if you don't throw it away, then you have the code there, right? You have code that's untested, and then, you know, it's going to stay. So if your product is successful, you're actually setting yourself up to having code that is really bad, right? That's untested, which is something that long-term will hurt you and slow you down more. So yes, you're going to spend more time upfront in writing more tests, but I think at the end of the day, you're going to set yourself up for success. And if your product succeeds, then you're going to be in a good situation. Now, of course, sometimes, right, there's you know, everything is a trade-off. You can't just, you know, do this blindly. So, you know, I hear your point, and I agree with it to some extent. You have to be very strategic about it, though. What I mean by that is that if you are very sure that this is very experimental and that, you know, there's a good chance that this, you know, may or may not succeed, and you are very sure that you really want to try this experiment, and, you know, all those ifs and buts and all those caveats, you know, it's sometimes okay to sort of, you know, let the best practices go. But when you do that, you have to really understand that you're taking a risk. And if you do that with everything you do, then you're obviously doing it wrong, because one of those experiments will succeed and become the product that you use and will be untested. So you have to do it very sparingly and very strategically. And by the way, if you're interested, sorry, one thing to add to that. If you're interested, there's a book called Blitzscaling. Was written by Reid Hoffman, I believe, the CEO of LinkedIn, who talks about this in great detail. He really dives deep into when is it good to do, you know, this kind of, you know, risk-taking where you're setting aside best practices and doing something so that your company can continue to grow. So, interesting book.
Hi, I would like to ask you your feelings about, you have been working in 3 big Silicon Valley companies, and I want to know your feelings about working nowadays there, that the companies that are staying there are moving, are people still staying there, are they moving to Europe? I don't know exactly what you're feeling about nowadays, what's happening.
Yeah. So I think tech generally is growing, right? So whereas 20 years ago, if you wanted to do tech, you basically had to be in Silicon Valley and maybe 2 or 3 other places. You know, there was a little bit in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a little bit in, well, of course, Seattle and Boston maybe, right? That was like the 4 places in the US that you did tech. But really, if you wanted to be where everything was, you had to go to Silicon Valley. Today, that's not true anymore. There's tech in many, many more places, and serious tech, right? So with numerous companies and like a robust ecosystem and places to work. I think Silicon Valley still is the center. It still has the biggest concentration of technology companies. definitely the biggest concentration of VC, venture capitalist firms that provide funding for those companies. I think it has still the biggest concentration of startups, and people are still coming in to Silicon Valley. So, you know, I'm not saying you have to go there if you want to do tech. I mean, I think you can do it in many, many places, but it still is kind of the mecca of the tech world.
Thank you.
Does anybody have more questions? No? Let's give a round of applause for Michel.